According to a study conducted by researchers at Stellenbosch University and UCT, South Africa's black middle class has more than doubled over the last 8 years, and racial inequality has declined dramatically. Henny Kotze is a research fellow at the Centre for International and Comparative Politics at Stellenbosch University, and John Simpson from UCT's Unilever Institute. They join us for more. Let's start with you, Henny, talking about this survey that you've done. I'm always puzzled with our government, because on the one hand they say we need to do much more. On the other hand, they don't often talk about what has been achieved. Now, it's not enough, but your kind of research tells us how far we've got. Where are we?
No, I think this is good news. You know, the doubling and more than doubling over the last 20 years in the middle class. It has implications, obviously, not only for the consumer market, but for the potential in the contribution to a stable democracy. That is where I, as a political scientist, would put the emphasis.
Just on, John, let's come to you quickly. When we take a look at the emerging middle class, some people interpret it to be maybe a cash cow for a lot of companies to access in the market. Would you agree with those sentiments?
Without any question. You know, South Africa's economy is fundamentally a consumption-driven economy, and we must be very grateful to the black middle class, its emergence, because in many ways it's maintained or is keeping the economy going. You know, the rest of the economy, certainly the poorer end of the economy, is really, really struggling at the moment. And so when you have economic growth of 1.92%, which is really not enough, without the black middle class's growth, it would be much, much lower than that.
Coming back to you, Henny, what are the other major things that are coming out of your report? And I mean, this is the kind of thing that can affect the political discourse, because it goes to the heart of the damage done by apartheid and the reparation for that damage in economic terms. Where can one go with this research? How might it influence policymakers?
It's obviously has implications for what we would call the cohesive or potential growth of our nation. You know, that it's a dynamic situation that we have in South Africa, and for policymakers, obviously, and the government, they will have to adapt, because people will, you know, put new demands on the table as far as the middle class is concerned. But there are also negative aspects to it, and that is that where we see the growth, especially in the emerging middle class, and that's a black middle class, it's a widening gap. So if the black middle class, if you would say that's a nation, it would have a very, very high Gini coefficient. That's the inequality in the black group. So those are the sort of things that the government needs to look at.
John, coming to you, just following up on Henny's sentiments there, that if the black middle class was an economy itself, the Gini coefficient would be quite high. How would the government have to solve a situation like that?
Well, it's rather interesting, because when we first did the study in 2004, where we identified this emergence of the black middle class, a lot of people in government were very critical, because they said this was divisive, it was actually reflecting elitism and so on. But the irony is that when we've done the study more recently, last year or early this year, the government seems to be very pleased, because they're saying, you see what we've done to grow a black middle class in this country. So it's very, very good for the country. It's very, very good for the marketers of this country to understand how important this particular group of consumers is. And as Henny was rightly pointing out, the gap between the black middle class and what we would call the survivor end of the market is actually getting greater. And so the real trick for me would be that the government needs, and business needs, to try to stimulate the poorer end to allow them to continue to play this catch-up game to become black middle class at that level, simply because of their ability to add such value to the economy.
Just on that, John, before I let you go, who is the black middle class? How would you describe them? What are the typical characteristics that they possess?
Well, the irony here, again, is that they buy more or less the same things as the white middle class does. So if you were to look at what they own and those sorts of things, no difference. Class plays over race. But the reality is that underneath that, the differences are quite profound. And it's got to do with the fact that we're dealing with a group of consumers who have a history, a background, who have actually got to a position in society in a fairly rapid space of time, short space of time. And so marketers actually need to understand those differences, which are really about their lives, about, for example, black middle class families are much, much bigger than white middle class families. So you have many more contributors towards that lifestyle, which actually makes up your so-called middle class status.
John, I just want to interrupt you there because we've got
need to understand that.
Time is not on our side, but I want to ask you both one more question, to Henny first and then to John. Cephas van der Berg noted in one of his, from Stellenbosch, noted in one of his researches that many affluent black people interviewed didn't like being referred to as middle class because it had connotations of race. Just like the word liberal can have connotations in South Africa for black people which it wouldn't have in the United States, for example. So you've got to be very careful with the language you're using, and supposedly neutral terms are not neutral for people.
No, you're absolutely correct, and you know the middle class is linked to a racial connotation in South Africa for black people, and that's what we found out in our research, asking people, and they shy away from this term of black middle class. But just linked to John, the consumer patterns are more or less the same, but you know the asset base, and that's why our black middle class. They don't have the asset base that the white middle class has. So there's a little bit of a difference catching up in the long term.
Yeah, and David, there's another difference too, and that is most black middle class people are first generation, whereas white middle class typically are third, fourth generation. It makes a huge difference to their whole states of the way they behave and so on. And so what Henny says is absolutely correct.